Deep caves are among the last truly unexplored territories on this planet. Speleologists, the scientists who dedicate their lives to studying cave systems, estimate that less than 20% of the world's cave networks have been mapped or explored in any meaningful way. Less than 20%. Which means that the vast majority of what exists beneath our feet remains completely unknown, unseen, and uncharted. We build satellites that map the surface of Mars with extraordinary precision. We send submarines to the deepest trenches of the ocean. But the caves beneath our own communities, beneath our own neighborhoods, beneath the ground we walk on every single day, remain largely a mystery. And where there is mystery, there is also something else. There is danger. There is the unknown. And sometimes, there is something that defies explanation entirely. The stories I am about to tell you are drawn from real accounts, real expeditions, real documented experiences of people who descended into the earth and encountered things that changed them forever. Some of them came back. Some of them came back different. Some of them did not come back at all. So settle in, keep the lights on if it makes you feel better. Though I should warn you, these stories have a way of making even a well-lit room feel suddenly very small, and listen carefully. Because every single one of these stories begins the same way, with someone deciding to go underground. And not everything they found down there was just rock and darkness. The first story takes us to Romania, to a place so strange, so biologically isolated, so fundamentally alien to everything we understand about life on this planet, that scientists who discovered it initially struggled to believe what they were seeing was real. The year was 1986. A construction crew in southern Romania, working in the Constanta region near the Black Sea coast, was drilling through limestone to lay infrastructure for a new power facility. Standard work. Routine excavation. Nothing that would suggest the ground beneath them held anything extraordinary. Then the drill broke through into an empty space. A hollow beneath the earth. And when workers peered down into the opening they had accidentally created, they felt a wave of hot, sulphurous air wash up over their faces. The smell was like rotten eggs, like something burning and decaying simultaneously. They had punched through the ceiling of a cave that had been sealed from the outside world for an estimated 5.5 million years. They called it Muval Cave. And what was found inside has been described by scientists as the closest thing to an alien ecosystem that has ever been discovered on Earth. I need you to think about what 5.5 million years of isolation actually means. That is longer than modern humans have existed as a species. The cave had been sealed, completely cut off from sunlight, from surface air, from rain, from any of the inputs that virtually every living thing on this planet depends on to survive. And yet inside, there was life. Abundant, thriving, terrifying life that had evolved in a way that should not have been possible. The cave's atmosphere is toxic by normal standards. The air inside Muval contains roughly 10 times less oxygen than we breathe on the surface. It contains carbon dioxide concentrations nearly 100 times higher than surface air. And it contains hydrogen sulfide, a poisonous gas, in concentrations high enough to kill an unprepared human. The cave is warm and humid, heated by geothermal energy from deep within the earth, and at its bottom there are pools of sulphurous water, yellowish and steaming, that look less like something from our planet and more like something from a science fiction film about another world entirely. Now here is where it gets truly unsettling. Because despite this environment that seems engineered to prevent life, the cave was full of creatures. 48 species were discovered inside Muval Cave. 33 of them existed nowhere else on Earth. Nowhere. They had evolved in total isolation, completely cut off from the rest of the biosphere, developing entirely new biological strategies to survive. Leeches, spiders, isopods, centipedes, pseudo-scorpions, water scorpions. All of them blind, most of them pale and colorless from generations without light, all of them feeding off a food web that begins not with sunlight and photosynthesis like virtually every other ecosystem on Earth, but with chemosynthesis. bacteria that feed on the sulfurous gases in the air and water, converting chemical energy into biological fuel, forming the base of a food chain that should not exist. Now I want you to ask yourself something. If an entire ecosystem of creatures, 33 species never seen before in the history of human knowledge, could evolve and thrive for 5.5 million years in a sealed cave beneath Romania, what else might be living in sealed cave systems beneath other parts of the world? Cave systems we haven't found yet. Cave systems our drills have not accidentally punched through. What might be living in the dark in places where nobody has thought to look? The first person to be officially lowered into Muval Cave for scientific research was a Romanian biologist named Cristian Lascu. He described the experience as descending into another planet. The air burned his throat. The humidity was so intense that condensation formed on his equipment immediately. The pools at the bottom glowed faintly, not from any light source, but from the pale, colorless bodies of the creatures that moved through them. He said that the absolute silence was the most disturbing thing. Not the toxic air, not the strange creatures, but the silence. A silence so complete and so ancient that it felt, in his words, like the silence had weight. Like it pressed against you. But the real horror of Muval Cave did not come from what was inside it. It came from a question that the discovery raised, a question that scientists have been quietly wrestling with ever since. If this ecosystem evolved independently from the surface world, developing its own biology, its own food web, its own species that exist nowhere else on the planet, then what does that suggest about the nature of life itself? What does it suggest about the possibility that other sealed cave systems, other isolated pockets of ancient Earth, might contain their own ecosystems, their own evolutionary experiments, their own creatures that have never encountered, never been disturbed by, and never been documented by human beings? There is a theory, and I want to be clear that this is a theory, speculative but seriously discussed among certain researchers in the field of astrobiology and deep Earth biology, that some cave systems may contain organisms so divergent from surface life that they would register as effectively alien in biological terms. Not alien in the science fiction sense, but alien in the sense that their biology, their cellular chemistry, their relationship to the world would be fundamentally unlike anything we have classified before. Muval Cave gave us a glimpse of what that might look like. But Muval Cave was found by accident, by a drill breaking through limestone. Which means that what was found there was found only because the ceiling was compromised. And it makes you wonder, how many other ceilings are still intact? How many sealed worlds are still waiting beneath our feet? The creatures found in Muval Cave are still being studied today. New species were still being identified as recently as a few years ago. And every time a new creature is pulled from those sulfurous pools and examined, it forces scientists to revise their understanding of what life requires, what it can tolerate, and where it can hide. But Muval Cave is not the only place where the Earth has kept its secrets buried. Not by a long way. And some of those secrets involve not just strange biology, but strange history. Strange disappearances. And in some cases, something that no scientific framework has yet been able to explain. The second story comes from the mountains of Kentucky, and it begins with a name that every serious cave explorer knows and speaks with a particular kind of reverence mixed with dread. Mammoth Cave, the longest known cave system on the planet. More than 400 miles of mapped passages, corridors, rooms, and tunnels, winding through the limestone bedrock of south-central Kentucky like a vast underground city. And beneath those 400 mapped miles, researchers believe there are hundreds more that have never been explored. Passages too narrow for human bodies. Flooded tunnels. Passages that end in walls of solid rock and then, impossibly, continue on the other side in ways that defy the mapped geography above ground. The Native Americans who lived in the region knew about Mammoth Cave for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. And they were deeply afraid of it. Not afraid in the sense of practical caution about a physically dangerous environment. Afraid in a way that was spiritual, categorical, absolute. The cave was not simply a hole in the ground. It was a boundary. A threshold. A place where the world of the living ended and something else entirely began. Artifacts found in the cave suggest that some groups did venture inside, likely for ceremonial purposes, harvesting cave crystals or conducting rituals in the dark. But these ventures were structured, deliberate, and clearly undertaken with a profound awareness of the risks involved. Not just physical risks, other risks. In the early 19th century, Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction, one of the first in North America. Guides, many of them enslaved men who were forced to lead visitors through the cave, developed an extraordinary knowledge of its passages over years of exploration. One of these guides, a man named Stephen Bishop, mapped portions of the cave that had never been seen before, crossing an underground river on a ladder to reach passages on the far side. He gave names to formations and rooms that are still used today. But the guides also spoke of things in the deeper sections of the cave that made even experienced explorers uncomfortable. Sounds that had no obvious source. Passages that seemed different on return journeys than they had on the way in. A persistent feeling in certain chambers of being watched, of presence, of something aware of you in the dark. Now, there is a documented phenomenon in cave exploration called cave sickness, or more formally, sensory deprivation disorientation, that can produce hallucinations, paranoia, and distorted perception. This is well established. When human beings are removed from all sensory input, the brain, deprived of the stimulation it requires to function normally, begins generating its own sounds, visions, the sense of presence. These are known, documented neurological responses to extreme sensory deprivation. But here is what makes the Mammoth Cave accounts genuinely difficult to dismiss. The guides who reported these experiences were not inexperienced, frightened tourists. They were people who spent more time underground than most people spend above it. Stephen Bishop explored the cave by lamplight for years. He knew its geography better than anyone alive. And even he, in documented historical accounts, spoke of certain sections of the cave where he would not go alone. Sections where the darkness felt different. Where the silence had a texture to it that he could not explain and that he did not believe was simply a trick of his tired mind. One such section was a passage beyond what is now called the bottomless pit, a vertical shaft dropping down into a space so dark and deep that early visitors who threw torches into it watched them fall until the flames winked out without ever hearing the torches hit bottom. Beyond this pit, connected by a narrow bridge of rock, lay passages that Bishop named but rarely visited. In one documented account, he described returning from one of these passages in a state that other people noted as unusual. He was pale. He was shaking slightly. He refused to describe what he had seen or heard, saying only that he had heard a sound in the deep passage that he was not willing to attribute to any natural cause. No one pushed him further, and the passage he had come from was not explored again for several decades. Ask yourself this. If you were deep underground, far beyond where any sound from the surface could reach you, far beyond where any animal from the surface world would logically be, and you heard something in the darkness ahead of you, something deliberate, something that paused when you paused and moved when you moved, what would you do? Would you go forward? Would you investigate? Or would you, like Stephen Bishop, turn around, come back to the light, and choose never to speak about what you had experienced? The third story involves a cave system in Mexico that holds some of the most breathtaking and disturbing crystals ever found on the planet. The Cave of Crystals, discovered in the year 2000 beneath the Nica mine in Chihuahua, Mexico, contains gypsum crystals of a scale that seems physically impossible. The largest of them are more than 36 feet long. Some weigh over 50 tons. They are translucent and white, catching and scattering light in ways that make the cave look like the interior of a geode the size of a cathedral. Scientists estimate they took up to 500,000 years to grow in the hot, mineral-rich water that once filled the cave. The air inside the Cave of Crystals is around 136 degrees Fahrenheit, with nearly 100% humidity. Without a special cooling suit, a human being can survive inside for approximately 10 minutes before suffering fatal heat stroke. Even with a cooling suit, Expeditions are limited to 45 minutes at maximum. The cave is accessible for a very limited time only because the mine's pumps keep the groundwater from flooding it again. When the mine is eventually closed and those pumps shut down, the cave will fill with water and the crystals will be sealed away again. Possibly forever. But it is not the crystals themselves that make this story disturbing. It is what scientists found living inside them. When researchers carefully extracted and analyzed the interior of some of the crystals, they found microorganisms trapped inside, bacteria and other microscopic life forms that had been sealed within the crystals for up to 50,000 years. And in laboratory conditions, some of these organisms were successfully revived. They woke up. Ancient life, older than human civilization, older than agriculture, older than recorded history, brought back to consciousness in a modern laboratory. Now here is the question that this fact raises, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. If microscopic organisms can survive for 50,000 years inside a crystal, sealed in what amounts to a perfect natural prison, waiting, metabolizing almost imperceptibly, essentially paused in time until conditions change, what does that imply about the nature of life? What does it imply about things that might have been waiting, sealed in stone, in caves that have not yet been opened, for even longer periods of time? There is a documented account from one of the early expeditions into the Cave of Crystals, before the cooling suits were standard, before the safety protocols were fully established. A geologist, a man of considerable experience and no reported history of psychological instability, spent approximately 12 minutes in the cave before being brought out in a state of severe distress. He was not suffering from heat stroke. His physical readings were within tolerable ranges. But he was crying, shaking, barely able to speak. When he was eventually able to describe what had happened, he said that somewhere in the middle of the cave, surrounded by those enormous white crystals, he had become absolutely certain that something was looking at him. Not the abstract, psychological sense of presence that is associated with sensory deprivation. Something specific. Something directional. He said he had turned to his left and felt with complete conviction that something in the crystals, something behind the translucent walls, was watching him the way you watch something through glass. Aware. Deliberate. Patient. His account was attributed to heat-induced hallucination and filed in the expedition records as a health incident. The coordinates of the specific section of the cave where this occurred were noted. Subsequent expeditions were asked to report any unusual sensory experiences in that area. The responses that came back were reviewed internally and, according to sources familiar with the research, were not published. What do you think was in those crystals? Do you think the organisms revived in the laboratory represent the totality of what might be sealed inside? Or do you think that in a cave that took 500,000 years to fill with life, there might be things waiting for conditions to change that we have not yet thought to look for? The fourth story comes from a place that most people have never heard of, and that is exactly the way its discoverers preferred it for many years. In the Abkhazia region of the Republic of Georgia, bordering the Black Sea, there is a cave called Krubera Cave, also known as Voronezh Cave, the deepest known cave on Earth. It descends more than 7,200 feet below the surface, which means that at its deepest known point, you are nearly 1.5 miles below where you started. 1.5 miles of solid rock above your head. Expeditions into Krubera Cave are among the most grueling, technically demanding, and psychologically punishing experiences in human exploration. They take weeks. The descent alone, fighting through narrow passages, squeezing through gaps that require removing equipment and pushing it ahead of you, rappelling down vertical shafts in total darkness, traversing underground rivers and sumps, meaning flooded passages that must be dived through in full cave diving equipment, takes days. The deepest sections of the cave have only ever been reached by a handful of human beings in history. And every single one of them has described the experience in terms that go beyond the physical. A Ukrainian explorer named Gennady Samykhin, who holds the world record for the deepest cave dive in history, penetrating into a flooded passage at the bottom of Krubera to reach a depth of nearly 7,300 feet, described the experience this way. He said that at extreme depth in the cave, the silence reaches a quality that has no analog in surface experience. He said the darkness becomes dimensional. Not just an absence of light but a presence, something with texture and weight that you move through rather than simply existing within. He said that on one occasion, at a depth of approximately 4,000 feet, while alone in a chamber waiting for his team to catch up, he heard a sound in the passage below him that he could not account for. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing, but too slow for any normal biological rhythm. Too regular to be water movement. Too consistent to be the settling of rock. He sat for several minutes listening to it before his team arrived and the sound stopped. He has not offered a definitive explanation for what it was. He noted it in his expedition log as an acoustic anomaly. But in a later interview, when asked about the experience directly, he paused for a long time before saying that the thing about the deep cave is that it never stops reminding you that you do not belong there, and that some of the reminders are harder to dismiss than others. The geological formation of Krubera Cave means that its lowest sections are ancient beyond useful comprehension. The cave began forming during the Mesozoic era, the dinosaur era. The rock through which these passages wind and drop has been shaped by hundreds of millions of years of geological process. Water that flows through the sumps at the cave's bottom has been in contact with those rocks for so long that its chemical composition is fundamentally different from surface water. And those sumps, those flooded passages at the deepest points that have only been reached by a handful of cave divers in history, have not been fully explored. Nobody knows how far they go. Nobody knows what is in them. The cave continues to descend beyond the current record point, continuing into rock that has never seen, never been touched by, and never been disturbed by any human being in the entirety of human history. What do you think is down there? Not what you hope is down there. Not what scientific probability suggests. What is something in the older, quieter part of your mind, the part that still understands things the way your ancestors understood them, in terms of darkness and depth and the wisdom of not going where you do not belong? What does that part of you think is waiting in the flooded passages at the bottom of the deepest cave on Earth? The fifth story is perhaps the most personally terrifying of all the accounts gathered here, because it did not happen to scientists or professional explorers. It happened to a group of ordinary people who made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and it cost several of them in ways that cannot be fully measured. In the spring of a recent year, a group of 6 young adults, ranging in age from 19 to 26, decided to explore a cave system in the Dordogne region of France. The caves of the Dordogne are famous for their prehistoric paintings, extraordinary galleries of Ice Age art created by our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago, and they are visited by tourists and researchers from around the world. The famous caves, Lascaux, Font de Gaume, Rouffignac, are carefully managed, with guided tours and professional oversight. But the Dordogne limestone is riddled with secondary passages, smaller openings, unofficial entrances that connect to unmapped sections of larger systems or lead into entirely separate networks that have never been formally surveyed. This group, we will call them by the names they used in their accounts, Theron, Mireille, Bastien, Celeste, Jourdain, and Odette, entered one of these unofficial passages through a low opening in a hillside that Theron had found while hiking alone the previous summer. He had gone only a short distance inside at the time, far enough to establish that the passage opened into a larger space beyond the entrance crawl, and he had noted it on his phone with the intention of returning with proper equipment. The group's preparation was, by the standards of anyone with actual caving experience, inadequate. They had headlamps. They had a rope. They had snacks, water, and a phone that got no signal underground. They did not have backup lighting. They did not have helmets. They did not have a formal route plan filed with anyone outside the group. No one above ground knew they had gone in. The passage opened, as Theron had noted, into a larger chamber after approximately 20 meters of crawling. The chamber was beautiful. The limestone walls were covered in natural formations, stalactites and stalagmites of various sizes, flowstone formations, and in one section, small cave pearls sitting in shallow pools like something deliberately arranged. Celeste, who later gave the most detailed account of the experience, described it as the most beautiful place she had ever been. For approximately the first 2 hours, the experience was exactly what the group had hoped for. Discovery. Wonder. The particular thrill of being somewhere that feels secret and ancient and entirely yours. Then Bastien, who was the most adventurous of the group and who had moved further ahead of the others into a connecting passage, called back to them. His voice echoed strangely in the limestone. He called out that the passage opened into something large beyond. Something that he couldn't see the end of. The others gathered at the entrance to the connecting passage and looked in. Their combined headlamps reached perhaps 15 meters into the darkness before being swallowed. But Bastien was already moving forward, and after a brief discussion, the others followed. What they found in the second chamber was remarkable. It was significantly larger than the first, and the walls here were marked. Not with the ancient paintings they knew from the famous tourist caves, but with something older feeling, simpler, stranger. Marks that looked deliberate but did not conform to any known pattern of prehistoric art that any of them recognized. Deep lines scratched into the limestone. A series of what appeared to be hand shapes, not the stenciled handprints common in Paleolithic art, but something else. The hands appeared to have been pressed against the rock and then carved around, deeply, with considerable effort, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and there were too many of them on one of the shapes. Odette counted. She said it had 7. Jourdain, who was studying anthropology at the time, said immediately that he did not know what the marks were. He said it with the specific certainty of someone who knew enough to recognize the boundaries of their knowledge. He said he had never seen anything like them, and that they should photograph everything and leave. The others agreed. But before they could begin the process of returning to the entrance, Theron's headlamp died. And then Bastien's. 2 headlamps failing simultaneously is statistically unusual. Both Theron and Bastien had checked their equipment that morning. The batteries were not old. There was no obvious reason for both lights to fail at that specific moment, in that specific chamber, among 6 devices in use. And yet both went dark at the same time, leaving 4 remaining lights between 6 people in the second chamber of an unmapped cave with no exterior rescue plan. They began moving back toward the connecting passage immediately. And this is where the accounts become difficult. Because Celeste, Odette, and Jourdain all independently reported, in separate interviews conducted afterward, the same experience during the return through the connecting passage. They reported hearing, from somewhere in the larger chamber behind them, a sound that none of them have been able to describe to complete satisfaction. Celeste called it a dragging sound. Odette said it was more rhythmic than that, almost like a very slow counting, a regular impact against stone with uneven spacing. Jourdain simply said that whatever it was not a drip of water, not a settling of rock, not any geological process he was aware of, and that it was getting closer. They moved faster. Bastien, navigating without a headlamp and relying on Mireille's light, caught his hand on a rock formation in the connecting passage and cut his palm deeply enough that it bled freely. He said later that what he was most aware of was not the pain but the smell of the blood in the confined space, and the sensation that the sound behind them changed in response to it. Became more regular, more deliberate. They reached the entrance crawl, moved through it, and emerged into daylight in a state of profound distress. Celeste was hyperventilating. Jourdain sat on the ground outside and did not speak for nearly 20 minutes. Theron, who was the last one out, described pressing himself through the entrance crawl with an absolute, total conviction that something was in the passage immediately behind him, close enough that he could feel the displaced air. He said that he did not look back, that this was a decision he made consciously, because some part of him was certain that if he looked back, the thing he saw would be something he could not recover from. The cave entrance was reported to the local authorities by Jourdain after returning to their accommodation. A team of professional cavers was sent to investigate 2 weeks later. They found the chamber, the connected passage, and the larger chamber with the unusual markings. The markings were photographed and sent to several researchers in prehistoric art and anthropology. The consensus opinion was divided. Some researchers identified them as likely examples of very early symbolic behavior, possibly predating the formal cave art traditions of the Upper Paleolithic. Others could not place them in any known artistic tradition and declined to speculate. The seven-fingered hand shape was noted in the official survey report as anomalous. The sounds that the group reported were attributed to sensory distress. The simultaneous headlamp failure was noted and not explained. Bastian's cut required stitches. He has not entered a cave since. Odette has a therapist. Theron no longer talks about the experience publicly. And Celeste, who gave the most detailed account I've described here, ended her interview with a statement that I find difficult to set aside. She said that the thing she keeps coming back to, the thing that sits with her in the months since the experience, is the marks on the wall. Specifically, the spacing of them. They covered a section of wall approximately 4 meters wide and 2 meters high. The marks were dense and consistent in style and depth. And when she thinks about what it would have taken to make them, not just the time and the effort, but the state of mind required to sit in that darkness, in that depth, in that silence, and carve deliberately into the rock for however long it took, she finds that she cannot imagine a human psychology that would produce that behavior. She said she is not saying it was not human. She is saying she cannot imagine the human that could have done it. The sixth story comes from deep beneath the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where an underwater cave system called the Sistema Sac Acton stretches for more than 347 miles, making it the longest known underwater cave system in the world. It winds beneath the jungle floor in utter darkness, filled with a kind of water so clear and still that divers describe it as flying rather than swimming through it. Looking up in certain passages, the surface of the water reflects everything below it perfectly, so that a diver sees another diver above them, floating in reverse, in an infinite, mirrored world. The Mayan civilization, one of the most sophisticated and scientifically advanced cultures in pre-Columbian history, considered these underwater caves, called cenotes, to be the literal entrance to the underworld. They called the underworld Xibalba, the place of fear. And they did not mean this metaphorically. They meant it with the same literal conviction that a modern person might point to an airport and say, "That is where you go to travel." The cenotes were portals, gateways to a realm of gods and darkness and forces that operated on human lives from below the surface of the world. Offerings were made at the cenotes. Objects, jade, pottery, obsidian blades, and in some cases, human remains. People who were consigned to Xibalba deliberately, their bodies committed to the dark water. In 2007, archaeologists exploring Sistema Sac Acton discovered human remains at a depth of approximately 40 meters in one of the flooded passages. The remains belonged to a girl, approximately 15 to 17 years old based on skeletal analysis, and were dated to approximately 12,000 years ago, making her one of the oldest human skeletons ever found in the Americas. She was named Naya by the research team, and her story became internationally significant for what her DNA revealed about the earliest populations to settle the Americas. But Naya is not the story that keeps cave divers in the Sistema Sac Acton quietly uneasy. The story that keeps them uneasy concerns a section of the system called the Room of the Bells. It is named for a particular acoustic phenomenon that occurs in a large air-filled chamber within the cave, where certain stalactites, when struck, ring with a tone that carries with extraordinary clarity and resonance through the still water and the surrounding passages. The Mayan priests who used the cenotes for ceremony knew this. The particular resonance of stalactites struck in rhythm was part of ritual practice, part of the process of communicating with or summoning the attention of what existed in Xibalba below. The Room of the Bells is well documented and has been visited by many divers. It is genuinely remarkable. But there is a passage that connects to the Room of the Bells, discovered in 2018 during an extended mapping expedition, that does not appear on any published survey of the system. It is narrow, descending, and ends at a depth where the water begins to take on a slightly different color, a faint brownish tint that suggests mineral content distinct from the rest of the system. At the end of this passage, in the floor of the cave, there is a hole. A circular opening, approximately 2 meters in diameter, descending into water that the lights of the discovery divers could not penetrate, even at close range. The water below the opening was darker than water in which you simply cannot see the bottom. It was dark in the way that Mayan priests meant Xibalba to be dark. Dark as a category. Dark as a destination. The lead diver on the 2018 expedition, an experienced technical diver who was asked that his name not be used in public accounts of the discovery, reported that when he hovered above the opening and directed his lights downward, his lights did not simply fail to illuminate the depth below. They appeared to be absorbed, to stop at a certain point as though the darkness below was not merely an absence but a boundary. He also reported that the water above the opening moved, not in the subtle, persistent current that runs through many passages in Systema Sac Actin, in a single, upward pulse, like an exhalation. A pulse of water rising from the opening as though something below had breathed out. He backed away from the opening. He signaled his dive partner to do the same. They returned to the surface without entering the passage. The coordinates were logged. The passage has not been re-entered. When asked about the experience in a private conversation with a researcher known to the compiler of these accounts, the diver said something that I want to share with you directly, because I believe it is important. He said that he has dived in some of the most remote and challenging underwater environments on Earth. He has dived in the Arctic under ice. He has dived in the Mariana Trench survey vessels. He has dived at night in open ocean. And in none of those environments has he ever experienced what he experienced above that opening. He said that the closest analogy he could find was the feeling of standing on a ledge and looking down, but with the additional element, the unbearable additional element, of the absolute certainty that something below was also looking up. He has not returned to Systema Sac Actin. He has not retired from diving. But he has not returned to that system. And he said, almost as an afterthought, as the conversation was ending, that he thinks about Naya sometimes. The 12,000-year-old girl at the bottom of the underwater cave. He wonders whether she went in willingly. He wonders what she saw before the water closed over her. He wonders whether what she saw was, in some sense that he cannot fully articulate, the thing he almost saw above that opening. And he said that he finds, somewhat to his own surprise, that this possibility, that she saw what he almost saw, is not a comforting thought. It is in fact the opposite. Because if the Mayans were sending people into Xibalba to communicate with it, and if Xibalba was real in some sense that we do not yet have language to describe, then the communication was presumably not one-sided. Something below was presumably listening. And if it was listening then, and if 12,000 years of stillness and darkness and waiting is nothing to something that exists in the deep below the already deep, then it may be listening still. The seventh story takes us to a cave in West Virginia that does not appear in any tourist guide, is not listed in any state geological survey, and whose location is known only to a small number of people who have agreed, apparently without formal arrangement, simply to keep it to themselves. I am going to call it the Greer County Cave, because the people who know its actual name have asked that the name not be shared, and because the county designation provides enough geographic specificity to be accurate without providing directions that someone might choose to follow. The cave was found in the 1970s by a man I will call Reuben Locke, because the name fits the story and the real name has been protected. Reuben was a local farmer and amateur spelunker, a cave enthusiast who had explored most of the known cave systems in his region over the course of decades. He knew the local limestone intimately. He knew where the rock was honeycombed beneath the surface and where it was solid. And one autumn afternoon, following a heavy rain, he found a sinkhole that had opened on a back portion of his property that he had not previously noticed. Not unusual in karst terrain. Sinkholes open regularly in limestone country when underground voids collapse slightly and the surface drops. What was unusual was that this sinkhole had an airflow. A steady, strong upward current of air rising from a crack at its bottom, warm and slightly mineral-smelling, suggesting a substantial open space below. Reuben spent the better part of a week carefully excavating the sinkhole opening. He removed loose soil and rock, widened the crack, and eventually created an opening just large enough for a person to lower themselves through. He went in alone. He should not have done that. Anyone with cave exploration experience will tell you that going into an unknown cave alone is among the most dangerous decisions a person can make. But Reuben was experienced, he was confident, and he was, in his own later words, too curious to wait. The cave below the sinkhole was a revelation. A vertical drop of about 12 feet landed in a chamber of a size he hadn't expected, roughly the dimensions of a large barn, with a high ceiling and several passages leading off in different directions. The formations inside were extraordinary, pristine, untouched. Cave environments that have never been visited by humans maintain an integrity of formation that is immediately apparent. Every stalactite is whole. Every pool of water is crystal clear and motionless. Every surface is unmarked. Reuben described the cave as feeling, in some specific sense that he found hard to articulate, new. Not new in the sense of recently formed. New in the sense of never before experienced. He said it felt the way a room feels before anyone has ever walked into it. He explored for approximately 3 hours, mapping the main chamber and the first sections of the branching passages. He found cave fish in a stream passage, small and white and blind, which was notable but not unheard of in West Virginia caves. He found a species of cave cricket in large numbers, clustering on the walls in sections so dense that the walls appeared to move when he directed his light at them. And he found, in the deepest passage he explored that day, a section where the wall had fallen away at some point in the geological past, creating a window from the passage into a void beyond. A space that his light could not adequately illuminate, that appeared to be extremely large, larger than the main chamber, but that required either a descent into it or a different access route that he had not yet found. He came back the next day, and the day after, and over the following months. He mapped the cave with a thoroughness and precision that was genuinely impressive for a self-taught amateur working alone. He found the descent into the large lower void. He found that it was indeed significantly larger than the main chamber. He found that it had its own streams, its own formations, its own populations of cave fauna. He found 2 additional chamber levels below the first void, each accessible by tight vertical drops that required him to use rope and technique. He found, at the bottom of the 3rd level, a passage that angled sharply downward and then became horizontal again, running for more than 200 meters before ending in a wall of flowstone. And in that wall, a gap, just wide enough for a person to push through sideways. He pushed through. The space on the other side of the flowstone wall was small, perhaps 4 meters by 4 meters. And it was different from everything he had experienced in the rest of the cave. The formations in the other chambers were natural, growing and accumulating according to the logic of water and mineral deposition over geological time. The room on the other side of the flowstone wall had formations, but they had been changed, altered. Several large stalagmites had been broken at their bases. Not broken by geological force, not the clean fracture of stone that has simply become too heavy to support itself. Broken deliberately, at consistent heights, in a pattern that suggested the broken pieces had been used for something, arranged for something. The broken stumps formed, very roughly, a circle. In the center of the circle, the cave floor was discolored. A darker, reddish-brown stain that had soaked into the porous limestone. The stain was old. Very old. Old enough that it had been partially covered by new mineral deposition, a thin layer of calcite forming over it the way scar tissue forms over a wound. Reuben came back up to the surface that day with a very specific emotional state that he later described in detail to the small circle of trusted cavers he eventually brought into his confidence. He said he was not frightened. He said he felt something that was distinct from fear, something that was closer to grief. Standing in that small room, in that circle of broken stalagmites, looking at the discolored floor, he said he felt something had been done there that he did not understand. Something that could not be explained by any of the frameworks he had for thinking about caves and their histories, and that the impossibility of the explanation, the sheer inexplicability of human presence at the bottom of a cave that had no known entrance until the sinkhole opened on his property, hit him not as a puzzle to be solved but as a weight. A weight he carried up with him and has never entirely set down. The cave has been visited by 5 people in total since Rubens' original discovery. All 5 of them have experienced what they describe as profound disorientation in the section of passages leading to the flowstone wall and the room beyond it. Not the physical disorientation of getting lost in a complex system. A different kind. A sense of temporal displacement, a loosening of the normal feeling of being anchored in the present moment. 2 of the 5 have returned more than once. 3 have not gone back. Rubens still visits the cave occasionally. He says he feels responsible for it in a way he cannot adequately explain, the way you might feel responsible for something you found and cannot fix. The discoloration on the floor of the inner room has been tested. Twice. By 2 different people with access to appropriate equipment. Both times, the results came back consistent with organic material. Carbon-based compound. Biological origin. The quantity and distribution of the staining suggested that whatever produced it was significant in volume. The age was consistent with the mineral deposit forming over it. Very old. The specific identity of the organic material has not been formally determined. The people who tested it have their own private conclusions. They do not share those conclusions with people they do not know well. But I will tell you what the staining looks like when you see it, and when you understand its context. What it looks like is something that was held in that circle of broken stone, in that small room at the very bottom of a very deep cave that nobody was supposed to find, and offered to whatever listened in the darkness below. Ask yourself this. If you found a room like that, a room that tells a story in the language of geography and stain and deliberately altered stone, a story that suggests human presence in a place where human presence should have been impossible, and that story seemed to be about something being given to something, what would you think was on the receiving end? The 8th and final story is the most recent of all the accounts in this collection, and in certain ways it is the most disturbing, not because of what was found, but because of what was followed, and because it is not yet finished. In 2019, a team of researchers conducting a biospeleological survey, that is, a systematic study of cave-dwelling biology, in a limestone system in the Carpathian Mountains of Central Europe, discovered a new species of cave spider. This is not in itself unusual. New cave species are discovered regularly in the limestone systems of Central and Eastern Europe, which are among the richest in terms of endemic cave fauna in the world. But this spider was unusual in several respects. It was large, with a leg span of approximately 11 centimeters, which is significantly larger than most cave spider species. It was pale white with no visible eye structures, consistent with cave adaptation but more extreme than most documented species. And it was found at a depth of nearly 400 meters below the entrance, much deeper than most cave invertebrates in the region are typically encountered. The research team, 3 biologists and 1 geologist, noted the spider in their field log and collected a specimen for further study. And then, on the 3rd day of their survey, they found more. Many more. Not a colony in the biological sense, but a trail. A clear, directional movement of spiders, all of the same apparent species, moving in consistent single-file lines along the cave walls toward a section of the system that the team had not yet reached. Individual cave invertebrates do not typically move in organized directional formations. They are generally solitary or loosely congregate in favorable microhabitats. A directed, coherent movement of multiple individuals in a consistent direction suggested something specific. Something at the end of the direction they were all moving toward. The team followed the trail. It led through 3 connected chambers and into a passage that descended sharply for approximately 60 meters before leveling off into a horizontal section. The horizontal section was warmer than the preceding passages, noticeably so, and the air in it carried a smell that the geologist on the team described as unusual. Not the typical mineral smell of deep limestone. Something slightly organic. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar. Like something between damp earth and something else that she said she could not name. At the end of the horizontal section, the trail of spiders ended at a wall. The wall was solid limestone. No visible passage continued beyond it. And on the wall, on the floor in front of it, and on the ceiling above it, the spiders were gathered in a density that none of the team members had encountered in any previous survey. Dozens of them. Perhaps more than 100. All still. All oriented toward the wall. All facing, in the way that blind creatures with no eyes can nonetheless face something, toward the same point. Toward a specific section of the limestone, roughly 1 meter in diameter, at about head height. The geologist put her hand on the limestone at that point. She described it as warm. Not the ambient warmth of the passage, which was elevated but consistent. Warm in a focal way. The way a surface is warm when something is generating heat from directly behind it. She put her ear against it. She stayed that way for several seconds. And then she stepped back. She looked at the spiders. She looked at the wall. She looked at her colleagues. She said, very quietly, "I think there is another space behind this. And I think something in it is alive." The team completed their survey of the other sections of the cave and exited the system. The specimen spider was submitted for taxonomic analysis and was confirmed as a species new to science, currently designated by a provisional code while formal description is underway. The section of the cave with the gathered spiders was noted in the survey. A ground-penetrating radar survey of the relevant section of limestone was proposed as a follow-up project. That survey has not yet taken place. The geologist, whose name I am not going to use because she is still an active researcher and has not authorized the public sharing of her account, has spoken about the experience in private settings, among colleagues and friends. She has said that what she felt through the limestone wall was not simply warmth. She has said, when pressed, that what she felt was more specifically familiar than warmth. That the quality of it reminded her of something, and that it took her several days to identify what it reminded her of. She said that it reminded her of standing close to another living creature. The warmth that radiates from proximity to a large living body. Not the warmth of a machine, not the warmth of geothermal activity, which she knows intimately from professional experience. The warmth of something alive. Something large. Something that was very, very close to the other side of that wall. And the spiders, all of those pale, blind, silent spiders, gathered at that wall like an audience at a performance, facing something in the dark that they could sense in ways she could not, were the last image she saw in the cave before the lights went out. Her headlamp. All 3 of her colleagues' headlamps. Simultaneously. For 4 seconds. For seconds of total darkness in a passage 400 meters underground with a warm limestone wall in front of her and 100 blind spiders and something enormous and alive on the other side. 4 seconds. And then the lights came back on. And the spiders were gone. Every single one of them. The wall where they had gathered was bare. The floor in front of it was bare. The ceiling above it was bare, as though they had simply ceased to be there. In 4 seconds of darkness. There are several theories about what happened. The first and most conventional is that the thermal reading through the wall was a localized geothermal anomaly. The spiders were responding to the warmth as a microhabitat preference, and they dispersed into small crevices in the surrounding rock during the brief period of lamp failure in a way that made them appear to have vanished completely. This is the theory that most researchers, when presented with the account, default to. It is a reasonable theory. It is also, according to the geologist herself, unsatisfying, because she knows cave invertebrate behavior and she knows the difference between dispersal and disappearance. She says they didn't scatter. She says they were simply gone. The second theory, which is speculative and which I am presenting explicitly as speculation, is that the spiders were engaged in a specific behavioral response to something in or behind the wall, and that the disappearance of the spiders correlates not with a lamp failure but with whatever was behind the wall becoming aware of the presence of the human observers. That the spiders, as organisms far more sensitive to environmental signals than human beings, detected a change in the behavior or state of whatever was producing the warmth, and responded to that change by retreating. And that the change in the behavior of whatever was behind the wall was itself a response to being listened to being felt through the stone, to being found. Consider what it would mean if that second theory were correct. Consider what it would mean for the systematic exploration of deep cave systems around the world. Consider what it would mean for all of the accounts in this collection. The creatures of Movil Cave, isolated for 5 million years. The sounds in the deep sections of Mammoth Cave. The experience of the geologist in the Crystal Cave. The pulse of water from the opening in Systema Sac Acton. The marks on the wall of the French cave with the 7-fingered hand. The slow counting sound in the depths of Krubera. The stained floor in the sealed room at the bottom of Rubens Cave. If these experiences are connected, if they are all evidence of the same category of phenomenon rather than isolated anomalies, what does that suggest about what is living beneath us? We map the surface. We map the oceans. We launch satellites and probes and submersibles in pursuit of the unknown. But the caves beneath our feet remain largely dark, largely unmapped, largely unexplored. And in those unexplored spaces, life has had millions of years to do what life always does. Adapt. Persist. Change. Wait. There is a concept in biology called the deep biosphere, the total mass of living organisms that exist not on the surface of the earth but within it, in the rock and sediment and groundwater far below the surface. Estimates of the total biomass of the deep biosphere suggest that it may exceed the total biomass of all life on the surface of the earth. More life by weight may exist in the rock beneath our feet than in all the forests and oceans and skies above us. Most of that life is microbial. Small, ancient, metabolically almost imperceptible. But the deep biosphere is a fact, not a theory. Life inside the earth is documented, real, and vastly more extensive than most people know. Which means the question is not whether there is life below us. The question is what kind. The 8 stories I have told you tonight span 5 continents, multiple decades, and a range of human experience from professional science to amateur exploration to the ancient ceremonial practice of civilizations that understood the caves in ways we are still trying to translate. They share a set of common elements that I find, the more I consider them, deeply significant. The sense of presence in the dark. The feeling of being observed. The sounds that have no geological or biological explanation. The lights that fail at specific moments. The evidence of things that have existed in the deep dark for far longer than any human has been alive. And the recurring sense, reported by people with wildly different backgrounds and wildly different relationships to the caves they were in, of having come close to something that is aware. Something that is patient. Something that has been in the dark so long that the dark is not a limitation but a home. A place where it knows the rules and we do not. A place where it has every advantage and we have none. The next time you are outside and you look at the ground beneath your feet, I want you to think about what is underneath it. Not abstractly, concretely. The rock, the water, the passages and chambers and voids that exist in a world below your world, a world where light has never been, where sound from the surface does not carry, where millions of years of isolation have produced biology that we do not have complete language for, where, in sealed rooms behind flowstone walls, in flooded passages deeper than any diver has yet reached, in the lower voids of systems still largely unmapped, something waits. Something that has learned patience in a way that nothing on the surface of the earth can learn, because nothing on the surface lives long enough and still enough to master it. The cave always knows you are there. It knew before you went in. It will know after you come out. And in the places where you did not go, the places you turned back from, the passages that were too narrow or too deep or too dark, it is still there. Still aware. Still listening. Still patient in the way that only the very old and very deep can be patient. With the patience of stone and darkness and time beyond our ability to measure. And the question that I leave you with tonight, the question that I think is the real question underneath all of these stories, underneath all of these accounts and experiences and documented moments of human beings coming into contact with something in the deep dark that they cannot fully explain or forget, is this. In a world where we insist on the comforting belief that we have mapped and understood and classified and domesticated most of what exists, where we tell ourselves that the monsters are metaphors and the darkness is simply the absence of light, what do we do with the persistent, recurring, cross-cultural, transhistorical human experience of going underground and encountering something that does not fit those assumptions? What do we do with the evidence that the Earth is not simply a rock we live on but a living system of extraordinary depth and complexity, within which other things, other organisms, other presences of unknown category, have been persisting and adapting and, in some sense that even the most careful researchers among those who've been down there find difficult to dismiss, watching? Go to bed tonight and listen. Not to the sounds in your room, to the silence below them. The deep, geological silence that is not really silence at all if you know how to hear it. And ask yourself whether you have ever, in any context, heard something in that silence that you immediately explained away. Something that felt, for just a fraction of a second, like it came from below rather than around you. Something that stopped when you focused on it. Something that waited. Because if you have, you are in better company than you might think. And the people whose stories I have told you tonight, the scientists and the explorers and the divers and the farmers and the 6 young people who went into a cave in France and came back changed, every single one of them heard it too. And none of them have found an explanation that fully satisfies. None of them have stopped listening. And none of them, not one of them, has gone back to looking at the ground beneath their feet without thinking, even briefly, even against their will, about what is underneath it. The earth keeps its secrets in the dark, and the dark keeps them very, very well. Sleep well tonight. And if you wake in the small hours, in the deepest quiet of the night, and the silence below you feels somehow different than it did before you listened to these stories, that feeling is your oldest instinct doing exactly what it was designed to do. Reminding you that you are not, and have never been, the only thing alive on this planet. Not even close. Not even on the surface. And certainly not below it.